excited today to have not only one, but two doctors and autoimmune researchers here on the Arthritis Life podcast, Dr. Mikacenic and Dr. Jane Buckner. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, can you both just really quickly tell me, how about Dr. Buckner first, where do you live and what is your relationship to arthritis?
Sure. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a rheumatologist. I've been practicing rheumatology now for almost 30 years. And so I, over that time, have gotten to know many, many people with arthritis and been involved in their care.
That's incredible. Thank you for continuing in the field. I know burnout is an all-time high, so we appreciate anyone in rheumatology. And Dr. Mikacenic, what about you? Where I know where you live, but for the audience, where do you live and what is your relationship to arthritis?
I live in West Seattle, for a while, the unintentional island, and I actually grew up in West Seattle. And my relationship to arthritis, I'm actually a pulmonologist. I'm a lung doctor. And actually my specialty within lung disease is seeing people who have autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis who develop lung disease, which can be a pretty significant and serious consequence. So that's where I see patients in this realm and really feel strongly about, trying to figure out things to improve that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And yeah, that's one of those things that you don't realize when you get diagnosed with something like rheumatoid arthritis. You, a lot of times as a patient, I'll say myself, focus so much on the joints because you kind of fixate on this word arthritis. You don't kind of understand till you've had it for a while or till it can kind of progress that, oh, wow, this affects my whole body, not just my joints. So I'm going to stop myself from like asking you a million COVID related questions because I know that maybe be another episode. But I love learning, before we're going to delve today into like the latest research being done in the autoimmune space, which is just very exciting, and why patient engagement in research, is important. But first, I always like to hear, how and why did you choose, I'll go Dr. Buckner first. Why did you choose to become a doctor and researcher and specialize in autoimmune?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. We all have different paths to our career. And I was really interested in science, and that interest in college actually became one that I was very interested in biomedical research. So I went to medical school and I had no focus on arthritis per se, but I had the really good fortune of doing a rotation and taking care of patients with arthritis, particularly patients in the hospital with really serious diseases like systemic lupus. I found those patients fascinating. Also, I was really engaged with them and how they manage their chronic diseases. And also, the fact that these diseases affect your whole body made it particularly interesting to me. So when I went on through my medical training, I focused more on the rheumatic diseases, including rheumatoid arthritis, and found that was an area that had so many questions that needed to be answered. And there was so much need for patients with rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and other autoimmune diseases that kind of became my ambition and my life's work, to understand these diseases so that we could actually treat them better. And as we're going to talk about at the end, could we prevent them and cure them?
That's so exciting. And I'm always just grateful that anyone chooses this field, because I would find it very overwhelming myself if I was having to do the biomedical side and the research side. And what about you, Dr. Mikacenic, Carmen?
Yeah, I think quite similar to Jane, I was always really interested in science, and that definitely developed when I was an undergraduate. I think the immune system is fascinating. I mean, it's sort of like it's at a simplest level, I think of it as us versus them, our immune system against the world. And so I think that's just a really interesting dynamic. I also think the lung is a really cool organ. I mean, it interfaces with our environment constantly, right? I mean, we have summer season where we have smoke and we've got to manage that, and, all these different things that we come across. So I think that's sort of what drew me to the lung specifically. And research is one of those things where when I see patients, I really have a hard time just not understanding why or not trying to understand why. We have patients with the same disease who have different manifestations in their lungs. You can have rheumatoid arthritis and have different things happen to your lung, and why that is, we don't understand. And there's just so many questions and a big need. And so I think I'm really driven to try to help understand some of those whys.
I mean, that's incredible. You just like literally blew my mind when you said how the organ or the lung is like connected to our environment. I don't know why I didn't think about the fact that it's just air. Yeah, that's amazing. And I remember in 8th grade when they brought, for the drug education, they brought to our school 2 lungs, like a lung of somebody who was a longtime smoker and a lung of somebody who didn't. And that really left an impression on me personally. And but you know, we can control our choices, like, you know, smoking, but we can't always control some of the environmental exposures. But anyway, so I would love to hear from both of you, just, you know, taking the 20,000 foot view about what's some of the latest research in the autoimmune disease space that people with rheumatoid arthritis or other rheumatic diseases might be really interested in.
Who would you like to have start?
Oh, why don't you go? We'll go in the same order.
I'll go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things to think about is what's really exciting now. And as I said, I've been doing this a long time, and the progress we've made in understanding these diseases is incredible. And the rate at which we're making discoveries is amazing to me. Things I wouldn't have imagined 10 or 15 years ago. But one of the things we know about autoimmune diseases, particularly arthritis, is that they are diseases that are multifactorial. We know that they run in families, so there's genetic risk, and we've been trying to understand that over the last 20 years since we sequenced the genome. We also knew there were environmental factors, and that touches on what Carmen just talked about, that there were some other triggers out there, because not everyone in a family, not even identical twins, all get these diseases. What I really think is exciting right now is that we're finally getting more of a handle on understanding how environmental factors are driving diseases, and actually how they influence the way our genes are being changed by the environment in a way that leads to some of these diseases. And we could have never done that without a couple of things. One is we had to understand the genome. We had to develop tools to actually understand how the genome's controlled. And then we had to start studying human beings and their environmental factors. And that takes a lot of work. And we're finally doing that in a way that can help us look at people at high risk for a disease and what happens to them over time that maybe causes the disease or causes flares of the disease. So I think we're at an exciting, pivotal time of integrating our understanding of genetics and the immune system, but how the environment is contributing to that.
That's really exciting. And then just for the audience, when you say environment, do you mean just things like smoke, or do you also mean, like, let's say, encountering like a virus or something like that?
Absolutely. Okay. That's a great question. When I mean environment, I mean the viruses you may have been exposed to. There's some exciting data in that realm right now, just in the last several years. Your microbiome, those, bugs that live on your body and in your gut that aren't causing trouble, but are actually interacting with your body and your immune system. But the smoke, we know smoking itself can increase your risk of rheumatoid arthritis twofold. And then what we eat and how much sunlight we see, all sorts of things are the environment. And I guess getting a handle on that and being able to start to dissect that is something I'm really excited about and think will bring us so much more knowledge and ability to help patients in the future.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What would you add to that, Dr. Mikacenic?
Well, I think, Jane, no, you're fine. I think Jane really highlighted some of the interesting things that are important to the field right now. One of the things I think about a lot is there's sort of 2 stages because of some of these factors Jane mentioned, and one is sort of prevention versus treatment. And I'm hopeful that really kind of big picture wise, we'll do a better job of having biomarkers or other clues where we can develop better ideas of who to predict will develop certain diseases, and then be able to intervene. I think that that's another potential big area.
Yeah, and along those lines, I know something I keep hearing about, thrown around is the idea of like precision medicine. I guess it relates exactly to what you were saying, but also once you've predicted who's going to get it, or who has it, predicting which medicines will work best. It does sometimes feel like we're throwing darts at the dartboard. Once you've failed one or two, like I'm on my 5th biologic right now in 20 years. I remember talking to my rheumatologist, and like in the beginning, it was like in 2003, it was like, okay, we're starting you on a TNF inhibitor. That's what's available. And then after methotrexate, and then as the years, it's like if this, then this, a little decision-making chart, like they have from the American College of Rheumatology. But once you get further down the chart, it's like you're trying to beat time. Do you know what I'm saying? With like, there's not as much data of like, if you failed a TNF inhibitor and then you failed Orencia and then another one, then do you do the JAK inhibitor or all that stuff? So I'm sorry, I'm like kind of word salad here, but do you think that we're on the way, like in the next 10 years, to really have a better idea of who's going to do better on which medication?
You raise a central point, Cheryl. This is my clinic, and this is the big issue my patients face, and I face as one of their doctors. I think it's really important, and it's one of the things we are focusing at the Benaroya Research Institute is this concept of trying to find the right drug at the right time. And that means we need to start focusing on understanding how patients differ and how they respond to drugs differently and when to use them. And so that's an area of research that I think many of us in the field are very focused on. And then it also gets us to this question that was just raised about prevention, because that is going to change the game, we think, in terms of allowing us to stop progression of disease before you get into that cycle of having to change drugs all the time. And there's new studies that are being done both in type 1 diabetes, where we've seen quite a bit of success, but also in rheumatoid arthritis very recently, suggesting that we may be able to intervene early enough to prevent progression. So that's where a lot of my excitement, and I think the field's excitement is right now.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah. And that gives people a lot of hope, because sometimes people get really scared if the first or second medicine they try, doesn't work. And sometimes I'll just remind them, we don't, or I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I'll say something like, typically like there isn't a perfect way of predicting which one's going to work for you, but there are a number of people who the first couple classifications of meds that they tried didn't fit their body right for whatever reason. And then the third or fourth one is like the home run, and works for 10 years or something. So there's reason to still have hope,
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think you state that that's the story. I'll talk my patients through when I start them. I'll say, I can't guarantee this is going to work for you, but if it doesn't, we'll move on to another drug, and we have a lot of options. That's what's wonderful about practicing rheumatology today. When I started, it was before we had TNF inhibitors. So that was a very different world. My waiting room had wheelchairs in it. It doesn't anymore. And that's great news. But it still seems silly to me to have to basically say, I'm guessing what drug to give you. And my goal and the goal of the other scientists is, let's not guess anymore. We need to be able to say what drug's the right drug for you before we just try it out. So that's the goal. I think we're moving towards that.
That's super exciting. Yeah. And yeah, speaking of what we're moving towards, so you're both at the Benaroya Research Institute. I'm sorry, I didn't even say that initially. So and the Benaroya Research Institute is an amazing place just in my backyard here in the Seattle area. And you are researching all sorts of conditions including rheumatology, rheumatic diseases. And so I'm really curious about Dr. Mikacenic's HIPCRV clinical study. Don't tune out. We're going to explain what that acronym is. And figuring out such a practical issue, which is literally how do people with rheumatoid arthritis respond to the common colds, like upper respiratory infections, which I'm so excited. Like, I feel like it's 2023. We've put a man on the moon. Like, how do we not know about the common cold or whatever? But anyway, so can you tell, you're studying people with and rheumatoid arthritis and without. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? What are you learning, and is there anything patients can do to get involved?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about it. So HIPCRV is Human Immunology Project Consortium respiratory virus. So our study is one of a few studies around the country that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. But what we are focusing on is how people really do respond to the common cold. So we know that people with rheumatoid arthritis can have, again, we talked about these environmental influences that might affect their disease progression. And we believe some of this happens at the lung surface, the mucosal surface. Jane said when people smoke, we know that increases risk times 2, right? So we think something's happening at the level of the lung with the way the immune system starts to recognize self rather than virus, for instance. And so what we're doing is we're monitoring people's responses, their immune responses before and during a cold and after, by doing simple things like nasal swabs. But it's amazing what we can do with a nasal swab, because we can detect the exact viruses, we can detect your immune response, how your cells are responding. We follow things in the blood to see how your blood's responding to the virus, but actually how your blood is also responding to self, or these autoantigens people develop in rheumatoid arthritis. And we think that by having the before, during, and after, we're going to really understand how the immune response may change over the course of that infection. And we're comparing people who are on TNF inhibitors or not to see how that might influence your response to the common cold, because obviously medications can have some effects on how your immune system might respond to these viruses.
That's so exciting. Is that something people can enroll in from anywhere, or do you have to be in the Seattle area or, local-ish?
So we collect our samples here at Benaroya Research Institute, First Hill here in Seattle. Certainly our participation's open to anyone who would want to be involved. There's a few in-person visits, but some of the nasal swabs and such, while people are feeling unwell, they can collect at home. So we're really encouraging anyone with interest to join. We do have a link on our website that people can email us if they have any interest, and we can, go back and forth and determine if they'd be a good fit for the study.
That's so exciting. I think I'm going to sign up.
Please do.
Great. Yeah. Is there anything, Dr. Buckner, you would want to add to that particular study?
What I think is exciting is this is a chance to bring questions that across the country people have been asking about viruses and how they impact how people respond to them. And Carmen's study is taking it straight to rheumatoid arthritis, where we're going to look at the impact with people with rheumatoid arthritis and also how their lungs are functioning, which is, I think, an understudied and understood, but very, very important thing about people's health who have rheumatoid arthritis. So we're really excited about it, really excited about partnering with patients who have rheumatoid arthritis as part of this study. It takes all of us to actually do this work.
Yeah. And I think one of the, a lot of people, when they first start their medications for rheumatoid arthritis, are worried about, the warnings on all the medications about, this might increase your risk of infections. I'm having a smile on my voice because I feel like I'm always hearing that commercial where it's like, tell your doctor if you've been to a region where certain fungal infections are common. I'm like, which fungal infections? I don't even understand. But anyway, but people are concerned, right, about getting sick more often, I remember I'll say her name because I've already talked about her before, Dr. Gorman, who's my rheumatologist. She's amazing. She said that, it's been really surprising to her over a little over 20 years of being a rheumatologist, that a lot of her patients don't actually get really, really sick, even though they're on these immunosuppressive therapies. And it's kind of like when you're pregnant. When I was pregnant, it was like the risk of a uncontrolled disease flare-up sometimes outweighs the risk of being mildly immunosuppressed on your medication, right? So it's kind of like your immune system is out of whack because of your RA, and you're taking the medicine to calibrate your immune system more normal to function more normally. But it's hard for people to wrap their head around, because they're like, uh-oh, I don't want to take this medicine because it's suppressing my immune system,
I like the way you put that, in that your immune system's out of whack. That's why you have an autoimmune disease. So these drugs are helping us get it back into the right place. And that's, I think, maybe a helpful way for patients to think about these drugs when they're fearful. We obviously have to be careful and be aware of risks. But you're right, not doing anything itself is a problem.
Yeah.
You're right. Controlling the disease is important.
It's like I almost think of it as like, it's too much of a good thing. Your immune system has created way too much, antibodies that are then misguided and then attacking your own, previously healthy tissue. And so you have to make too much into a smaller amount is logical, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to make it back to the normal amount. I'm going to suppress some of the extra ones. But I think, medication hesitancy, just from a psychological perspective, is really fascinating to me. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but it's such an important one because, I think, and this is me being on social media a lot too, I see so many people being so scared to take medicines and having this kind of bias towards natural methods. And it's almost like, it's so important. I feel like I'm like a historian, like telling people, like, just like you're like Dr. Buckner saying, you were practicing for 30 years. Like, you don't understand how lucky we are to have these medicines, Mm-hmm. So sorry, I'm just like going on my soapbox, but, I think that, the best advice I actually saw for medication hesitancy was from a nurse practitioner at the American College of Rheumatology conference. She said, I tell my patients, think about starting a new medication like dating, not a marriage. You're just, it's going to be out of, if it doesn't work well, it's going to be out of your system. It's not like a tattoo, where you're stuck with it forever, so just see. And so many patients will come up to me, and because I've done little videos, saying, just a different perspective. I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't take medicine. That's your choice, but you should have an informed choice, that is not just biased towards natural methods only. And they'll say, like, I was so scared to take the medicine. I finally took it. And within like 2 weeks, it was like, I could open my hands up and I could, function in my life. And I actually regretted not starting it earlier. Anyway, do you hear that story a lot in your guys' clinical practice, in your both clinical practice?
I'll come. I'm sure Carmen has comments as well. I really saw a lot of that probably about 10 years ago. There are a lot of hesitancy when we first introduced the biologics. And some patients even waiting a couple of years before they would start a drug like a TNF inhibitor. And then they'd have permanent disability because we couldn't reverse the progression. I see less of that today. And I think, although some people still are a little reticent, I think there's more and more of an understanding that intervening early really means that you will do better long-term. And I do point out to patients that before we had these treatments, life expectancy in patients with rheumatoid arthritis was 10 years lower than everyone else's. So it wasn't a benign thing to live with active rheumatoid arthritis. So I see people accepting it more. There's always hesitancy, but I think you're explaining it really quite beautifully and why it's important.
Yeah, and I think I always tell people, for me, it's easier for me I can speak personally, right? Because I want to be really careful not to give people medical advice. Even I'm an occupational therapist, but even as an OT, if I was in a one-on-one interaction, it's way out of my scope to give someone medication advice. But since I'm a patient, I can kind of be like, my perspective is, the enemy is the disease, not the medication. Yes, the medication, the disease is, like you said, it's progressive by nature, right? For some people, progresses faster, some slower. And it's also, reduces your lifespan to, like, depending on the study, like 7 to 10 years, if not controlled. So, why not give yourself the best chance? And again, it's easier. Some people would say, well, you've had good response to medication, so maybe I'm a little biased, but I think the data supports the medication, So, but anyway, it's just, I think you do get a biased sample on social media because there's so many people out there that are peddling like natural cures and methods so I'm glad to hear that in the clinical practice, you really do see more of a random sample, right? You're seeing whoever got diagnosed. The non-randomness is the geographic part, but otherwise you're seeing a good cross-section. And Dr. Gorman pointed that out to me too, that sometimes there's like a silent majority of patients that are just, I tell people I know people who I know from swing dancing who have RA, who just started methotrexate. That alone is controlling it. They're on their merry way, living their life. They're not posting about rheumatoid arthritis all the time because it's not dramatically affecting their life. But anyway, sorry, back to the research. So you also have a study on predicting and preventing type 1 diabetes, which people listening, they might not know. That is an autoimmune. Type 1 is the autoimmune type. Type 2 is the type that can be, reversed through, would you say reversed or, managed through, through weight loss and diet and stuff.
Well, I'd be happy to talk about that. And it's important. So I'm a rheumatologist, and one of my passion is studying and treating rheumatoid arthritis, but I have spent most of my career also studying type 1 diabetes. So as you said, it affects younger age people, and it's an autoimmune disease where you're no longer able to make insulin once it becomes established. So you have to take insulin externally every day. And it's a little different than type 2 diabetes, which you can manage through medications and diet. Why am I studying type 1 diabetes is one question. And the reason is that the genes that are linked to the risk for rheumatoid arthritis are the same as the genes in type 1 diabetes. And in fact, I've now met so many families where mom has rheumatoid arthritis and their child comes in with type 1 diabetes. And so understanding that link is really important because it helps us understand what drives both diseases. And also, if we find treatments for one, we can apply to the other. So what's exciting about type 1 diabetes is that over many years and the work of many families, patients, and providers and scientists, we can now predict who's going to get type 1 diabetes. And that's because we can identify antibodies and genes that, if they're there, indicate that you will at some point get type 1 diabetes. And in fact, we can predict your rate within 2 years. That's not helpful unless you have something you can do about it. But what that has allowed us to do is do clinical trials with medications to see if we can delay or even prevent that. And so groups, particularly type 1 diabetes TrialNet, my colleague Carla Greenbaum here at BRI was leading that group at the time they did a study with a drug called teplizumab. That drug delayed the development of type 1 diabetes in children and younger adults for up to 2 years. We think it may have cured some people. And what's so exciting is that the FDA approved that drug to prevent type 1 diabetes last November. So that's the first drug ever to be approved by the FDA to prevent an autoimmune disease. And that seems pretty radical. These people don't have diabetes yet, but we're going to give them this medication. But if we think about it, it's not that radical because we do this all the time in medicine. We know that having high blood pressure puts you at a high risk for getting heart attacks and stroke. Well, so we call high blood pressure hypertension, and we treat high blood pressure with medicines. And in that case, we know within 5 years, 3% of people we're treating would be at high risk for a stroke or a heart attack. In type 1 diabetes, we can now predict within 5 years that, or within 2 years, 50% of people will have diabetes. So preventing is something we're used to. We treat cholesterol, we treat high blood pressure. The time has come for us to predict who's going to get autoimmunity and treat it. What's really exciting is in rheumatoid arthritis, we also know the markers that predict disease, and we are already starting to do trials to try to prevent that disease. So families where rheumatoid arthritis is present, we would screen those people and start trying to prevent. So type 1 diabetes is has been out in the lead, but it's shedding a light so that we can start thinking about this in many autoimmune diseases, including rheumatoid arthritis.
That is incredibly exciting. And I will admit, despite being so involved in the rheumatoid arthritis, world and doing so much, research on my own and such, I was totally blindsided when I got gestational diabetes, because I actually didn't realize gestational diabetes is more like type 1 than type 2. I was like, oh, I'm on track with like my, my weight gain, and I'm eating, well, I wasn't eating perfectly. I was eating taco time, tater tots all the time, but, but I was like, I was shocked when I got gestational diabetes, and it wasn't that hard to manage. Thank goodness. It was a pretty, I think, mild case. I was able to manage it through dietary interventions and exercise, just making sure to exercise around when I would eat carbs. But I didn't know, right, that it was, I actually didn't even know that I probably didn't even know that type 1 was autoimmune back then. So anyway, this is extremely exciting. And, this is a small side note, but related. I did a volunteer trip in Belize in 2004, a year after my diagnosis, actually. And long story short, a fellow volunteer went into a diabetic coma, had no idea she had type 1 diabetes. She had been feeling really off the whole time she was in Belize, but she was thinking it was the weather. She was constantly sweating, hungry, craving sweets, thirsty, urinating a lot. Oh, well, I'm in Belize. That's the, and then she suddenly, anyway, it was a horrific, she got misdiagnosed as having a panic attack. And then they gave her steroids for some reason in the ER there. And then she'd gotten, by the way, get emergency travel insurance. She'd gotten a $40 emergency travel insurance that covered a $20,000 at the time medevac medical airlift airplane for her to go from Belize City to University of Chicago Medical Center, and she ended up getting treated and everything. So
well, and the point, I think one of the points that we've learned now that we can screen for people at high risk for type 1 diabetes and identify them, we've been able to clearly demonstrate that we're avoiding those kind of outcomes because people are aware that they're at risk, so they don't go in to this really severe, life-threatening situation. So I think that's part of the good news of being able to predict these diseases, and that should happen less often once we start doing this in the clinic.
Well, I know people listening, a lot of them have rheumatoid arthritis or similar. They're like, wait, how do I get screened? How do you know? Is there a way like that you can ask your doctor to screen you now for the genes to develop type 1, or how do you do that?
That's just being developed. And we're working hard here at BRI to be part of that and develop national screening that is in primary care. I think you'll be seeing that within the next year or two become available. Now that we have a drug and it makes sense to screen people because we can treat them, we have to put a few things in place clinically. So people should keep an eye out for that and ask their primary care provider and pediatricians if they're in a risk group.
That's really good. I know that I get my A1C, is that what it's called? The blood, because of having gestational diabetes makes me, and RA, now I know, makes me more likely to, develop type 1. They screen that every so often to make sure, it's not out of whack. But yeah, I mean, even if you didn't have a medication for it, just knowing it, then you would know the signs, right? And know what to look for. Because so often these signs, they don't seem so severe at first, like excessive thirst and urination and craving sweets and being irritable and stuff. You're like, oh, you can always, say those were just from randomness, or it's the summer or whatever. So that's really exciting. And I want to move on to we actually have a schedule here. I'm trying to keep myself to. So on the website for the Benaroya Research Institute, BRI, if you've heard us use that acronym, is to predict, prevent, reverse, and cure diseases of the immune system. So you are like going for gold. Like, let's be ambitious. Let's not just stop with predicting and preventing. Let's reverse and cure. But I know that I will, relating back to my social media advocacy before, I tell people sometimes be careful about anyone who is telling you that they have the cure, like today, right? So this is not to say there is a cure right now, but do you think there's going to be a legitimate, cure for diseases of the immune system? Like, let's say in my lifetime, like I'm 41, about to turn 42. So in the next like 40, 50, 30, I don't know when I'm going to live to years. This is crystal ball time. Which one of you wants to take that one first?
Carmen, do you want to start and I'll wind it up, or do you want me to start? It's either way.
This is a $20,000 question.
Yeah, I think that is a really challenging question. But I really do think that a cure is possible. I think we're starting to really get a better sense of why the immune system is doing what it's doing. And really, to cure something, you have to know why the immune system's doing what it's doing to be able to kind of reverse things, right? Or to make it go away completely. I do think that's where studying the immune system in humans is really important, right? Because we're unique, and that's why we've developed large cohorts of patients here, so we can study these things in detail. I completely agree with you. There's no cure right now. But, for instance, I think one of the things we're seeing with lung disease is that, we are seeing sometimes fewer people with lung disease with rheumatoid arthritis. And is that because we're intervening earlier with different medications? I, in some ways, consider that a cure because I'm not seeing the problem as much, which I think is amazing. So that's sort of my 2 cents. I do think it's possible, but I do think that developing the underlying knowledge is really the critical piece.
Yeah, that completely makes sense, that we're understanding the immune system so much better, and we have to complete that understanding maybe before developing the cures. What about you, Dr. Buckner?
Yeah, so as I said, I've been doing this a while, and if you'd asked me if we should put the word cure in our mission 10 years ago, I would have been very reluctant. But 5 years ago, when we thought about our mission, and we really thought deeply about this, and I think we can get there. And not only, I'm hoping we do it faster, Cheryl, than in the next 40 years.
Yes.
And maybe that's because I've been doing this a while and I'm getting impatient. But the reason I think we can do that is because of the accelerated rate of knowledge that we have about how the human immune system works, both in health. That's something we think is really important to study, because our job is to get one that's out of balance back into balance so it looks healthy. And I think we have the tools to answer those questions. I think we have the first glimmers of hope with the early studies showing prediction and prevention. If we truly can predict and prevent, we can eliminate these diseases. You just won't see them anymore. So we won't have to cure them once they're established. But we're seeing new forms of treatment that I think have the potential to do better than what we're doing now. Treatments that are targeted specifically to the disease, to the tissue that's being attacked by your immune system, not just blanket suppressing your immune system, which we're currently doing with any of our drugs. So I am very hopeful. We can't cure these diseases yet, but I think if we work together, and together I mean, scientists working together and collaborating with doctors, patients, patient families, and our broader community and getting support from the government to do this research. All of that together, I'm really hopeful. I think we have the tools in hand. It's going to take time and commitment to do it.
That's extremely exciting. I mean, honestly, didn't even really think to hope for that, in the sense, like, I think this is going on way to the mental health side of things, but like I really practice this approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's really helpful for me because it's basically kind of like saying the null hypothesis, right? Is that things won't change. So you say, can I accept and calibrate my expectations to my reality currently in a mindfulness sense, and also in a sense of like, can I tolerate and make space for the present moment and find joy and find meaning and purpose in my life now, if nothing else changes, or even if it gets worse. And it kind of gives you that confidence to say, okay, expect the worst and then prepare for the best, right? And then when things go better than expected, you're pleasantly surprised, versus kind of hanging all your hopes on like a brighter future that might never come. But it is definitely, I think it's possible. I'm stubborn in this way, but I think it's possible to kind of open up to acceptance of whatever is going on in the present while also having hope for the future.
So, and I think that's a wonderful way to think about living with arthritis. And it's what I admire about my patients when they're able to do that so well. And in fact, I would say to them, their job is to do that. And my job is to try to fix it. So, I need to take it to the lab, and I'm inspired by them. I think you're absolutely right about, as a patient, how you need to live your life as fully as possible. And Carmen and I need to keep pushing ourselves to change that reality.
Yeah, no, and we need both, right? We need a multi-pronged approach. Yeah, and I think this kind of leads. Oh, sorry, did you want to say something else, Carmen? Or
No,
okay.
That was just, yep, I agree.
You're just agreeing. Yeah, we're in agreement.
Wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a whole, I'm very fascinated by acceptance kind of being it sounds like a bad word at first, right? But long term, it's really helpful, I think, for me to it's been helpful for me to really work on accepting the present moment, and find joy in the present, even if there's some pain, and it's really, I think a lot of people are scared to do that. It's almost in a kind of almost a denial sense, like, no, it's about to get better. It's about to get better. Put your life on hold for, you can keep doing that for years. I finally went to therapy for the first time ever when my son was 1 year old. And I told, one of the first things I told the therapist is, I think I might have some sort of postpartum mood thing. It doesn't really feel like depression because I'm not sad, but I'm like irritable and anxious all the time. And I don't feel like myself. And like, I don't know what to, I don't know how to, are you feeling like loss of pleasure in things you formerly found pleasurable? I don't know. I never had a baby before, so I can't compare this to anything. Like, this, like, every question you ask me is impossible to answer. But she, was like, I can't tell. I said, I feel weird because like my baby's not a baby anymore. He's not like an infant. Like, is this postpartum depression? What is this? And she's like, I cannot tell you. I think he was 13 months old. And she's like, I can't tell you how many people come here right after the baby turns 1. Because it's like everyone's told themselves, just make it through the first year, and it'll get better. And they make it through the first year and it doesn't get better. And so they're like, okay, now I need help. And I think that's the same way. It's like, I put everything on hold. Like, okay, I'm just going to figure out the first year and get through this. And then everything's going to get better. And then it didn't get better. And I think, so you have to learn how to cope with whatever is happening in the present. But anyway, sorry, this is like precious time to have you both here. So I don't want to just talk about me, because the rest of the podcast you can hear about me. But so in patient engagement and research, I think a lot of patients are, I'm going to project for a second, but I have donated my blood to the Benaroya Research Institute with my son, and he got a compliment. I still remind him of that anytime he's had to get blood work. Because remember how they told you that you were one of the he was, I guess, one of the calmest little kid patients that they had there collecting the blood. I was so proud of him. But anyway, I'm fine to like donate my blood, but sometimes I get nervous about the idea of like participating in like a experimental drug, because I'm like, oh no, it hasn't been approved. So can you bust any myths, like, or for anxious people like me who might be like, I don't know about engaging in research because I might like, I don't want to be like what do they call it? Like a lab rat or something like that. Because it's so important for us to participate. So I'm saying like, that's the wrong thing, is to say that you'd be a lab rat. So help me bust those myths. What would you say to reluctant patients?
So I guess the first thing I would say is that I think a lot of people, when they think about research, think about drug trials, right? They think about, I'm going to get a drug or I'm going to get a placebo. And we can learn really important things even without doing any intervention, just by observing the immune system and how it changes, like my study during respiratory viruses, right? So I think that there is, even participating at a level you're comfortable with, in terms of like donating samples and those types of things, collecting clinical information, can be really powerful for us. And I, I was I have participated in BRI studies myself as well. I was in the Pfizer vaccine trial. I talked to my mom about it. I was like, I'm going to go try this vaccine. I actually told her at the time, I'm like, I'm not sure if this is going to work, this mRNA thing.
Amazing.
But I'm gonna try it, and she signed up too. I think the other thing too is here, it's I felt very comfortable with the setup they have. We have a really nice place where people can go. It feels almost like a clinic office. There are people who are dedicated to doing this kind of research, collecting blood, taking, your first nose swab, or showing you how to do it for my study. And so it's you're working with people who are really experienced, and I feel like it's a very comfortable environment. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's super helpful. What about you, Dr. Buckner?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been being a research participant is that we as the researchers really see it as a partnership, and there's a lot of care taken in thinking about the participants, their rights, how their experience is going to be. The thing that surprised me over the years, particularly there are participants who either are in a drug trial, but also those that are giving us samples to study their disease, is how much they enjoy being part of that process, being part of helping to find the answers, and having them thank me to let them be in the trial. And that's, we're thinking we're asking for their help, but it's really a mutual thing. And so I think there's a lot of, I think it's really a good experience for everybody. And we certainly appreciate the fact that those participants, without them, none of this goes forward. We can't do our work without a partnership with patients and their families.
That makes so much sense. It really reminds me a bit of like the legislative advocacy piece, in the sense that as a patient, sometimes you can feel there's a little bit of a helpless feeling. Like, let's say your insurance company is denying your medications and you're like, what can I do? Well, participating in advocacy, like going to Washington, D.C. or writing to your representatives, is something you can actually do to help the situation. In the same way, participating in research is something you could literally physically do that can help your own future as a patient. So there's very few other ways. Most patients are not also, PhD or MD, researchers, so they can't necessarily, many of them are, but the majority aren't. So we can't always like lead our own trial, but you could participate in a trial. So, or in a study, not just a trial. So
I would just add to, what you're saying, I think is so true. And I think some of it is that it's because it's like an active choice, right? It's a conscious decision someone's making to participate in research, right? It's a step forward, and they are deciding to take part in something sort of after considering hearing about the study. And I, similar to Jane, have so many people who participate in the studies who are actually really energized by the process, I think in a way that they didn't anticipate, maybe even at the beginning. So it's really true.
Yeah, it's a very empowering thing, I think. And so, yeah, and I love your points about it being a partnership. I know some patients who are, who have done lots of patient partnerships with even like the development of a research study. So saying, okay, for example, my friend Eileen does a lot in Canada, and she, kept telling the researchers, don't forget fatigue. This is more when they're looking at quality of life. Like, why are you only looking at pain? Fatigue can be more debilitating than pain. So those kind of insights are so important to have the patients involved with, right? Because I think a lot of patients, again, if they don't truly understand how systemic the disease is, they won't even think to mention fatigue to their reumatologist, just be like, oh, no, I'm just, I'm tired, but whatever, I'm just going to tell you about my joint pain. So, we're going to kind of start the wrapping up phase of this, although I would love to talk about, both of you are so eloquent and just passionate. It's wonderful to talk. I feel energized talking to you. And do you, one of my favorite questions to ask is what words of wisdom or advice would you give to somebody recently diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis, or a similar condition? I'm sure, both of you have had to do this in your clinical practice. So maybe you have an elevator speech, or do you have just anything you'd want to share, even if it repeats what you said earlier, that's fine.
Yeah, well, I've certainly, had the opportunity to tell people their diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis or lupus many times. I think every individual is going to hear that a little differently. I kind of tell them the bad news is I can't hear them. Hopefully the good news is they don't mind visiting me every 3 months. But, the thing is that the good news is that we can treat these diseases today. So I think it's important for people to get diagnosed, not to avoid the diagnosis. I know we all want to avoid getting bad news, but getting in early, getting a diagnosis, because we can, in many, many cases, really treat people to the point that, my goal is that when they wake up in the morning, the first thing they think about is not their rheumatoid arthritis. And if I get there, then I'm really successful. And we do get there with some of our patients, and we definitely make people's lives better with our current medications. So treatment really has come a long way. It's good to have knowledge about it so you can care for your body and keep it going well. And I always like to let them know that we're a team and they've got other people on their side. They have the doctors, the caregivers of all types in the health system. And then they have scientists who are behind the scenes trying to make the future even look brighter than it is right now.
That's beautiful. I think that putting it in such practical terms, the goal is for the first thing in the morning for you not to be thinking about the RA. That's totally congruent with, I remember telling Dr. Gorman, my definition of quality of life is just that I'm not distracted by my condition. It's not something it's something that comes up, right? But it's not a constant noise in the background. Pain can be, a noise in the background that makes it hard to focus on your life, but I think that's just beautiful. Especially because a lot of people with RA wake up with morning stiffness. So you're literally, I want you to wake up not thinking this is not a medical.
Absolutely.
And that teamwork, is the goal. What about you, Dr. Mikacenic?
Yeah, so I think similarly, I think part of it is when you're telling someone that news for the first time, it can be really overwhelming, right? And so some of it is giving yourself an opportunity to pause, but also I do put things in a positive light. I have had the advantage of having some of these medications while I've been practicing, right? So we can do things for people to make them feel better. And I think for me, Jane talked a lot about the partnership for research, but it's a partnership in their clinical experience, right? It's about what they're wanting to try, what side effects they may have, how we have a dynamic relationship where, they're really deciding what's best for them and how I can help them by providing them with the right opportunities, choices, and those sorts of things. So I think it's a relationship, right? And that first visit's probably the hardest, but some of it is that you develop the relationship and you work together over time to really get them in a better place.
Yeah. And I mean, I've gone on record saying this numerous times. My diagnosis was a gigantic relief. I mean, I was elated. So it's not always bad news because I had been experienced I call it accidental medical gaslighting. I don't think that anyone actually was like, ha, I'm going to convince her she's not sick, but I actually think she's sick. They legitimately didn't think that I was sick. They thought I was a hypochondriac. And so they kept saying, you're not sick, you're just anxious, you're just anxious. And so when I got this proof that I'm sick and that my RA factor and everything was off the charts, I literally was like, thank freaking God. Like, now they're actually going to believe me, because it was a horrific. I mean, the worst part for me was being undiagnosed, by far worse than anything I've experienced due to my condition. So I get so riled up thinking about this. Anyway, I've gone to therapy, like I told you. So it was an unimaginable nightmare to feel like no one's taking me seriously. It's like your house is on fire and the firemen are like, no, it's not. Like, what do you do? Who do you call when everyone you go to says that you're just a hypochondriac? Was horrible. So I was like, thank you. Oh my God, there's like a doctor it was like a whiplash. Like, it was like, you're faking. All of a sudden, actually you have this serious condition, and they're like acting so serious about it. I'm like, well, what? Like, all I care about is that you're telling me that you believe me. I don't even care what I have. Like, just give me the medicine. So anyway, that's my story. But thank you both so much for your time. I know you're both very, very busy saving the world, saving the autoimmune world. And I will share all your social media links and for Benaroya Research Institute in the show notes. And so people can know maybe where to find you and follow up on the latest and greatest. But thank you again so much.
Thanks for giving us the opportunity to share with you what we do. And it was a pleasure to hear your story as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This was really fun. And I appreciate everything you're doing for the community too. It's really important. So thank you for having us.
Thank you both. And maybe we'll have you on for not to put pressure, but maybe later on there'll be a follow-up on, what's latest and greatest in a couple more years. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.